Here's everything you need to know about the June 2024 format in around 20 minutes.
This guide is going to tell you how you can prepare yourself to beat the top decks of this format. So without any further ado, let's hop straight into it. The way this is going to work is I'm going to go over what I think are the most represented decks and the decks you're most likely to run into, cover their general game plan, as well as their top 3 strengths to look out for, as well as common counters and certain cards that can be used to beat these strategies. So the first deck we're going to talk about is Snake Eyes and Snake Eyes variants. Now, the general game plan of Snake Eyes variants is to build a board of layered disruptions. So this is going to be things like IP Masquerena, potentially hand traps to back it up, as well as Promethean Princess in the graveyard with strong follow-up. Its top 3 strengths include its many extenders. A lot of the times, a single hand trap just isn't enough to stop the deck unless they have a somewhat awkward hand. The Snake Eyes deck also has huge snowball potential, meaning a single card like Snake Eyes Ash or Diabellstar can essentially create a full board with full follow-up, making it very difficult to out-resource this deck if it gets going. Finally, it has lots of space for non-engine. Now I'm going to be talking about some common counters that are used to beat this deck. Just keep in mind that this isn't going to cover every single card that's good out there. Rather, I'm going to be showing what I think are the most common cards that can be representative of a group of counter cards. So starting off with hand traps. I would say probably the most prevalent one you're going to see is cards like Effect Veiler being used to hit a card like Snake Eyes Ash. Snake Eyes Ash is their main starter card, and being able to use an effect negator on it means both effects will be shut off, making it so your opponent has to have an extender to keep playing. Something else you can use to counter this deck is cards that make it so cards can't hit the graveyard. So for example, cards like Dimension Shifter or Different Dimension Ground. Different Dimension Ground is one I highlighted in particular since it is a card that most decks out there can just simply slide in when they choose to go first. Finally, power spells like Triple Tactics Talents. It does offer you a lot of potential utility with the threat of stealing an opponent's monster like Appaloosa, or drawing into more powerful board breakers to help break through the board. The next deck we're going to talk about is Tenpai Dragons. Tenpai Dragons aims to OTK your opponent after hand trapping them or break through whatever board they set up. Its top 3 strengths include its consistent OTK potential, since pretty much all the 1-card combos lead to way over 8,000 damage. It also has a lot of space for non-engine. Like Snake Eyes, it's able to play a bunch of hand traps, which contributes very well to its going second strategy, making it so it's very likely that they're going to have some sort of interaction to stop your opponent from being able to set up. And finally, perhaps its biggest and most unique strength is its ability to completely ignore interactions with a card like Songin Summoning. For those of you who don't know, Songin Summoning is the field spell that essentially makes it so all fire dragons on your field are unaffected by your opponent's activated effects during main phase 1, which can be pretty silly and make it so a lot of your plays go uninterrupted. Now, some common counters for this deck are going to include hand traps as well. A card like Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit can be very good to hit a card like Songin Summoning, since once you clear it off the board, not only do you stop them from getting their consistency surge, you also stop their protection effect as well. Do note that other cards like Ash Blossom are also particularly good to stop a card like Songin Kaiman. Do keep in mind that traditional hand traps like Veiler and Impermanence that may be good against other decks aren't necessarily going to be good against this one because of a card like Songin Summoning, which sort of just invalidates them. For going first, you want to side in floodgates like Dimensional Barrier, since their main way to OTK is using Synchro Monsters. Some of them do play the Promethean Princess into Zelantis and Raging Phoenix combo, which does allow them to set up a Link OTK, albeit it is a lot more fragile than their regular combos. And finally, there are some cheese cards like Threatening Roar that you could put into your deck, but this is mostly representative of any card that can make it so your opponent can't attack. A lot of the Tenpai players' best plays are going to happen in the battle phase, so if you have a way to stop them from getting there, or stopping their monsters from attacking, they can't really get anything going. Next up, we're going to talk about Voiceless Voice. Voiceless Voice is able to build a board of layered interruptions with strong follow-ups. Notably, they're one of the few decks that puts up an Omni Negate in their turn 1 end board through a card like Skull Guardian. They also have pops with their trap card, as well as a Summon Negate that they'll get off of Saravis later on throughout the turn as they use up their interruptions. Its top 3 strengths include a very strong grind game of recursion, because a lot of the continuous spells and traps give them constant value every turn. Layered interruptions, finally potential resilience to hand traps and strong standalone cards, make it so that this deck is able to sometimes just play through common hand traps like Ash Blossom and Effect Veiler due to how powerful their single standalone cards. Moving on to some common counters that are used to stop this deck. A card like Drone Lockbird is very good against this deck since it does a lot of searching, and of course you'll want to use Drone Lockbird on the resolution of their very first search. Next up, Dimensional Barrier is also a pretty strong going first card against this deck since you can simply call Ritual, and without their Ritual monsters, they struggle to get a lot of bodies out onto the board and are unable to generally set up anything meaningful. Finally, back row removal like Lightning Storm and Harpy's Violet Duster are also very good because they do end on a couple of continuous spells and traps that do offer some utility for them even on your turn, making it so that if you're able to bait out the Skull Guardian Negate, you can easily take out a couple of their resources and follow up with just a single card. If you've gotten this far in the video and have found it helpful, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel. Only a very small percentage of my viewers are actually subscribed, and it would mean the world to me if you guys could just check if you're subscribed, even if you think you are, because there's a chance that you actually aren't, and by subscribing, you let me know that you enjoy these types of videos and motivate me to keep making more, since they do take a lot longer than my other regular uploads. We're going to be talking about Labrynth next. Labrynth's game plan is to slowly control the pace of the game and out-resource their opponents with their myriad of monster and trap card effects in the graveyard. Their top 3 strengths include a very strong grind game and recursion, like I mentioned, because a lot of their cards have multiple different effects, not only on the field, but also in the graveyard, as well as layered interruptions, meaning it's not a typical back row deck in the sense that if you clear their back row, then you're essentially going to win, because like I mentioned, a lot of their cards have effects in the graveyard, but Labrynth is also a deck that's able to play a lot of hand traps, meaning they're not always going to commit everything to their board. And perhaps Labrynth's most unique strength is that it's easily adaptable to any meta. You're able to play a variety of different tech cards in your main deck, different hand traps, as well as different trap cards to specifically target key matchups in the metagame, which not every deck can do. Common counters for Labrynth are going to include cards that negate their welcome Labrynth trap cards, like Ash Blossom or Ghost Belt in the case of Big Welcome Labrynth. Being able to cut them off from summoning their big monsters from the deck is essentially going to make it so they're unable to really establish much of a board presence, and just playing with normal trap cards usually isn't enough to hold the game down enough in their favor. Speaking of hand traps, Bystials and other ways to remove their furniture from the graveyard can also be very good, since their furniture is essentially what gives them their recursion and can generate more advantage for them in the long run. And finally, like I mentioned, even though it isn't always going to lose to back row removal can still be pretty good since they'll generally always trade favorably, at least in terms of card advantage, and sometimes there are just going to be hands where the Labrynth player simply has to set a bunch of cards and hope for the best, since at the end of the day, it is still a trap deck. The next deck we're going to talk about is Branded. Now, Branded's game plan is to set up either their quote-unquote FTK with the Gimmick Puppet Lock, or make a layered fusion interruption board that has a banish from Mirror Jade and a pop from Guardian Chimera with lots of follow. Branded's top 3 strengths include a very strong grind game and recursion offered to it by its myriad of different grave effects, as well as layered interruptions, meaning once again, it's very hard to clear out all of Branded's interruptions since they do have interactions from the graveyard, the field, the back row, and even the hand. Finally, Branded has huge snowball potential as well. Single cards alone, like Branded Fusion, are able to do so much and essentially establish the entire Branded board on its own, meaning that if you're unable to stop these key cards from going off, you'll find that it's very difficult to crack through your opponent's board regardless of how good your hand is. Now, some common counters against the Branded deck are of course going to be Ash Blossom on Branded Fusion, which is perhaps their most important card in the deck. Now, it's important to note your opponent might have ways to play through Branded Fusion, but generally holding Ash Blossom for Branded Fusion is definitely correct, whereas using your other hand traps like Effect Veiler and Impermanence on cards that would get to Branded Fusion are also generally correct as well. Cards like Dimensional Barrier are also very good since they are exclusively summoning fusion monsters from the extra deck. And finally, Bystials and cards that remove cards from play in the graveyard are also very good, and in particular, it's good at stopping the Gimmick Puppet FTK. We'll essentially send Gimmick Puppet Nightmare to the graveyard, and then use a card like Albion to summon it back to your side of the field, making it so you can't special summon for the rest of the turn, meaning essentially you lose. So cards like Bystial Magma to hit this out of the graveyard before they're able to summon it to your field. Cards that remove cards from play in the graveyard are also good to stop their follow-up, and other cards like Branded and Red. Next up is going to be Chimera. Chimera's general game plan is to set up a layered fusion interruption board with a pop through cards like Guardian Chimera, and a hand rip through cards like Chimera, the King of Phantom Beasts, as well as very strong follow. Its top 3 strengths include its huge snowball potential, since a lot of its starters essentially get it to its full end board as well as follow-up, its layered interruption, and finally, its adaptability and flexibility at the end board. People have been splashing in the Melodious engine as well as playing cards like Beatrice in their deck, making it so they can do a variety of different combos just by using the main Chimera engine. Counters for the Chimera deck are going to include Ash Blossom and Joy Spring, on particularly their key card Big Wing Berfament. Of course, if your opponent normal summons a card like Mirror Sword Knight, you definitely want to Ash Blossom that since they won't be able to summon out the body onto the board, but in general, you want to aim your hand traps towards a card like Big Wing Berfament since it is able to get them the +2 in card advantage and get their fusion spell into rotation. Dimensional Barrier once again is a very good card at stopping this deck since they are almost exclusively reliant on fusion summoning. And finally, back row removal can be good as well since it will force out their quick play fusion spell early. Next up is going to be Purrely. Purrely's game plan is to set up a very hard to out Purrely Noir, essentially just protecting the big towers monsters with strong follow-up. Their top 3 strengths include their resilience to interruptions. So for example, all the Purrely quick play spells essentially are starters and extenders, meaning if you have just a single hand trap like Ash Blossom, it generally isn't going to be enough to stop them. In addition, if you do have cards like Effect Failure or Infinite Impermanence, your opponent could simply just activate another quick play spell and be able to summon out another cat from the deck, making it so they can continue with their plays. Purrely also has a very strong grind game and recursion given to it by My Friend Purrely and Stray Purrely Street. And finally, they have a flexible extra deck toolbox since a lot of the Purrely monsters are very good in different situations, and Purrely has access to the full rank 1 toolbox. Some common counters against Purrely include Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit on a card like My Friend Purrely. My Friend Purrely is one of the key cards to hit because not only does it act as consistency for your opponent, it also acts as follow-up. So by taking it off the board, you're taking away essentially 2 things from your opponent at once. Other hand traps like Ash Blossom can trade 1 for 1 against quick play spells, and generally cards like Infinite Impermanence and Effect Failure can be good if your opponent has a somewhat of a weaker hand and doesn't have enough extenders to put another cat onto the board. Once again, a card like Dimensional Barrier is very good because Purrely is an XYZ deck, and they lose out on a lot of their utility and value if they're unable to go into their Xyz monsters. And finally, cards that are able to out Noir like Underworld Goddess can be very good as well since their main game plan strictly revolves around setting that up on their field turn 1. Next up is Floowandereeze. Now Floowandereeze's game plan is to lock the opponent out of the game using their cards like M-Pen, Floodgates like Harpy's Featherstorm, and trap cards like Dreaming Town to set your opponent's board face down, while out-resourcing your opponents with the little bursts that return to hand every turn. Floowandereeze's top 3 strengths include a huge snowball potential, because a single bird essentially gives them a grind game for the entire game, since every time they normal summon and tribute with it, they're essentially going to get it back to the hand. They also have a very strong grind game and recursion, and finally, perhaps most importantly, the deck can play a lot of the big blowout cards in the format like Dimension Shifter and Featherstorm, which not many other decks can play. Some common counters against Floowandereeze are once again going to be hand traps, since this deck does struggle with consistency a little bit. Being able to stop their starters like Robina, or even cards like Pot of Prosperity with Ash Blossom can be very good. Cards like Effect Failure and Impermanence are also generally pretty good against their starters as well. Back row removal like Cosmic Cyclone is good, and Cosmic Cyclone in particular is very good because you're able to hit the Dreaming Town, which can be only used in the main phase. And finally, Floodgates like There Can Be Only One that restrict your opponent from having multiple birds on the field are also very good. Generally, the birds are also very small, so if you make it so they aren't able to put their big birds onto the board with a card like Skill Drain as well, it'll also be very difficult for your opponent to actually win the game. Next up is Melodious. As an engine, its goal is to set up negations before getting onto the main combo of your deck, or setting up a resilient board with strong follow-up if you're playing the pure version. Its top 3 strengths include huge snowball potential once again, meaning a single card like Ostinato is able to set up essentially their full end board on their own, or establish a board of multiple negates as well as a consistency card. They are also very resilient in terms of their end board if you're playing the pure version, because of a card like Aria, which protects them from being targeted by card effects or being destroyed by battle. And finally, its ability to make interruptions or act as consistency when it's played as an engine is probably its greatest strength out there, since it doesn't really take up much space in your main and extra deck, but it gets you so much mileage from just a single card. I wanted to go over some common applications of the Melodious engine, And the first one, like I mentioned, is to set up Omni Negates like Appaloosa or Odd Eyes Vortex Drink. A single Ostinato can set both of these up, but like I mentioned, Melodious also has the capability of acting as a consistency card. So if you want to make a card like Infernal Flame Banshee in a deck like Snake Eyes, you can certainly do that. Or if you want to use Melodious as a rank 4 toolbox instead of setting up Omni Negates, you could make cards like Abyss Dweller or Baguska as well. Common counters to stop the Melodious deck are going to include hand traps once again. Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit in particular is pretty good against Couplet, since Ogre and Couplet will not only prevent them from getting a search, it will also remove a potential fusion material from the board, since the Melodious fusion spell can use cards in the Pendulum Zone. You want to use cards like Ash Blossom and Ghost Bell on Ostinato as well, since that is one of their key starters. Dimensional Barrier is also very solid against this deck, since they are reliant on fusion summoning. And finally, ward breakers like Forbidden Droplet do have the potential to help you play through the board, albeit a lot of the times it may not be enough, meaning you likely need to compare this with some other cards like hand traps or other board breakers in order to successfully break through your opponent's board, since they generate so much advantage from just a few cards. Next up is Kashtira. So Kashtira as an engine offers free extenders and disruption through cards like Kashtira Birth and Kashtira Unicorn, or as a pure deck, it aims to simplify and control the game by trading favorably, since all the cash monsters essentially will almost always trade favorably into boards. Now, its top 3 strengths include its ability to play blowouts like Dimension Shifter. Main deck monsters trade very favorably, since not only are they free summons, but they're also big, meaning you're able to generally clear a monster and then get its effect to either force out interaction from your opponent or gain more advantage on your side. And finally, as an engine, it's probably one of the best extension tools out there, since it doesn't take up your normal summon, and they generally don't have to play many bricks in their deck to be able to fully utilize it. In terms of what Kashtira can do, like I mentioned, it could just be used as an engine to generate free bodies on the board, or allow a deck to play a card like Dimension Shifter, since they now have a pretty solid engine to fall back on after shifting the opponent. You could also go down a more combo route, where you play a card like Mecha Phantom Beast Draco Sack, generating you 2 tokens and making it so you could turn them into a card like Heat Soul. Finally, and perhaps most simply, it's just used as more extra link material, since a single Kashtira Unicorn does give you 2 free bodies, since you're able to add Birth to your hand. Some common counters against the Kashtira deck are going to include Ash Blossom and Joy Spring. You want to use Ash Blossom on their consistency spells like Wraith Sloth, as well as Pot of Prosperity if they're playing the pure version, not necessarily on the monsters, because their monsters like Kashtira Unicorn can still gain advantage even if you do hand trap them. It's important to note that if your opponent is playing Kashtira as just an engine, you generally don't want to hand trap them, since it isn't really adding much to their end board. Cards like Effect Veiler can also be good to stop their first special summon monster and prevent them from starting their plays, since they're unable to summon another Kashtira from the hand. Cards like Lightning Storm that can clear out the back row or clear out monsters can be very good, since both of them are very strong forms of interaction on the Kashtira player's side. Finally, effect negators and board breakers can be very strong. The last deck I'm going to talk about is Runick and Runick variants. As an engine, the Runick cards offer free extenders with the fusions or disruption with the quick play spells. But if you're playing as a pure deck, generally it's played in a way where it aims to simplify and control the pace of the game and stall your opponent out, either through deck out or simply making them unwilling to play the game further. Its top 3 strengths include its flexible and adaptable engine. Its engine can fill a lot of different holes in certain decks out there by either offering them a strong engine to fall back on or extra extenders. They also have a very strong grind game, since a card like Runick Fountain constantly recycles their resources while also chipping away at the opponent's grind game by banishing resources off the top of their deck. Finally, in the pure version, they can also play many floodgates like Skill Drain. Some common Runick variants, like I mentioned, are going to include the pure stun version, which simply aims to deck out your opponent by slowing the game down and making it so they're unable to play. There are, however, some combo variants of Runicks out there, including Chimera and Plunder Patrol. Essentially, the Runick engine in these decks either give them a stronger grind game, better engine to fall back on, or extra extenders to help them push their plays through. Some common counters for the Runick deck are going to include Ash Blossom. You can hit their consistency cards like Runick Tip, or in particular, hitting Runick Fountain when they try to draw on your turn is going to make it so they're unlikely to have more interactions from the hand. You do want to play cards like Cosmic Cyclone in particular as well, since it is able to out a card like Runick Fountain, which is their key piece of interruption, whether it's being played as an engine or in a pure deck. By playing Cosmic specifically, it does get around the protection effect of Hugin, which is one of their main Runick monsters that they're going to play. Finally, mass back row removal has the potential to be good, but it's conditional on the fact that your opponent's not going to have Hugin to protect their back row. That's going to do it for this video. Hope you guys found it informative and you guys enjoyed what you saw. Let me know if you guys like seeing this type of content by leaving a like, commenting, and subscribing so that I know that you're interested in seeing more of this in the future. Before we end off this video, I just want to give a quick shout out to Your Playmat. If you want to get your own custom playmats, tabletop mats, or card sleeves, then be sure to check out Your Playmat using my link in the description below. You'll be getting some cool new accessories that you can show off with your very own custom design, and if you use code SAM10YP, you'll get an additional 10% off your order. Well, with all that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.